So this is going to be an act of shameless self-promotion because I finished a book on Euroscepticism, and that was also a lot of work. So I've been quite busy with finishing up and giving talks about that. So I kind of wrote an essay which takes some of these ideas that are in the book and also tries to kind of juggle them in a new way in order to make it interesting and fitting to this particular conference. And I think it fits to what Bridget was already saying today. And actually, Eve's comments, I'm from nowhere, that's actually a political statement nowadays. Or I'm from nowhere, or I'm from anywhere in the UK, that's a very famous book. But the idea that there is a lot of waning support for international cooperation, and that this has been going on in the European context for quite a long time, and what we can learn, and what this also tells us to support for international cooperation in other areas. So what's the matter with Europe, right? We've had enormous crises, and in some ways the EU has recovered, but in some ways it clearly hasn't. And these crises, refugee crisis, Eurozone crisis to be specific, have left a legacy on how the way that people perceive the European Union, and the idea gives them a kind of a different answer to what have you done to me lately. And basically the bottom line of my book is what have you done for me lately differs where you live. So it's as easy as that, right? So if you're from Spain versus when you're from the Netherlands, the way you're going to see what the EU has done during this crisis period is going to be fundamentally different. So the EU is kind of in an interesting period at the moment in time, because before, when I gave these talks, there were like all Eurosceptic parties on the photos, but we've had the politicization of the other side now, which is Macron, and Thierry Baudet is the example from the Dutch context, which is the Wilders is kind of out. We have a new guy on the kind of block, and he is even more Eurosceptic. Actually, one of his core elements is being extremely Eurosceptic. So this idea of propagating a Nexit referendum, what Thierry Baudet is saying, versus Macron is stimulating reform in the EU, is kind of this kind of political dimension that, of course, many across on this table, from Edgar and Hans-Peter, but also Lisbeth and Gary have talked and highlighted. So that's not necessarily new, but it's the context against public opinion is going to be important. So the kind of shameless self-promotion is here. This is the book if you find it interesting. And as you see, there's kind of the illustration is national balloons that make up the EU, and these domestic contexts and the way domestic contexts shape public opinion is key in my approach. And then the UK, Brexit also has something to say with it. The UK is there hanging. I was asked, does it mean that the UK is going to be very successful because it's going up? Well, a balloon has to go up. Who knows what will happen? There's also a little bit of a string there. It could still be kind of pulled back. So we'll see what happens with Brexit. So what I kind of show in the book by using a set of natural experiments, of survey experiments, of in-depth cross-national survey analysis is to see that Eurosceptic as a phenomenon is hugely dynamic. It's very responsive to public opinion. So it's a very different story from the permissive consensus in which the public more or less granted elites a buffer to do whatever it wanted to some extent in Brussels, and thought that more aligned what was going to happen was going to be in line with their interest. That's no longer the case. The public is watching very closely. Then also Euroscepticism is extremely multifaceted. So what it means to be a Eurosceptic in Spain, or what it means to be a Eurosceptic in the Netherlands is fundamentally different. What it means to be a Eurosceptic in Austria, what it means to be a Eurosceptic in Italy is fundamentally different. The policies you care about, what you want the EU to do, is fundamentally different. And as I show also in the book, the way you want the EU to be reformed is also fundamentally different. And the interesting element is that this is hugely problematic for the EU at the moment, because people are watching. They have particular ideas about what the EU should be delivering. However, they differ tremendously about that. And the way we usually think that an institution deals with those differences is through some form of representation, democracy, democratic elections. But developing any form of reform in that area, so supranational elections, an elected EU president, as I show in the book, is hugely unpopular amongst the public. So the political solution to this is in some ways, according to Simon Hicks at least, is to kind of politicize it and do it at the EU level. However, the EU can't really touch that because of ratification failures probably at the domestic level, and just the fact that actually those institutions and those changes are not supported among the public. So what I then kind of show in the book, and that's important, I think. I mean, and we kind of knew. I mean, we know that public support for the EU is transactional, because the loyalty that people have to the EU, some of us in this room might be very loyal and have a very strong identification with the EU, but the average citizen clearly does not. It is very much a system where people are questioning what has that, in a kind of Sharpian sense. The output is what have you done for me lately, right? But what have you done for me lately, interesting, what I show in the book, is not just about the outcomes of the EU, but also the way people perceive that the process is fair. And that's actually something that where people in the north of Europe care about more. So that's kind of a little bit of a taster. So the way we've thought about, and I'm going to leave the kind of identity explanation out, because there's many people here in the room that know much more about it than I do, which is Lisbeth and Gary. So I am not at all saying that existing approaches don't work, because they do. Utilitarian approaches, interest approaches, identity approaches to support are very important. But in the latter period of where we see Euroscepticism rising in certain contexts, don't fit nicely with especially the utilitarian model, and also in some extent not 100% with the identity model either, because we don't see kind of developments of exclusive national identity in some of these contexts. So what I'm talking about is why you see this is a vote share for hard Eurosceptic parties, so in the kind of Taggart approach, so parties that are vocalizing exit or some form of serious breakdown of the status quo, and that's in the 2014 election, plotted by unemployment rates. And in the kind of idea of Gabel and others, it's, well, the way your country is performing in terms of economic factors, or the way you can benefit also from that economic growth, will make you more or less supportive of it. What you interestingly see is that Euroscepticism in the crisis period has increased in countries that have dealt with the financial crisis extremely well, and that actually benefit from the market extremely, because they're very small, highly open economies in the Katzenstein way. So this, not to say that interest doesn't matter, but it cannot be the only story. So kind of what I highlight might be missing is that support and opposition towards political and economic cooperation is to think about what people do in their minds. So when you want to make a stylistic model, which I do in the book, it basically boils down to a comparison of the benefits of the status quo, so the EU membership as such, and a possible alternative state. This alternative state is unknown and risky, i.e. what would your country look like outside of the European Union? It's not so unknown anymore maybe for some Brits, but for a very long time this is really was a very kind of unknown, and I'll come back to that Brexit example in a minute. So, and what I show in the book, that in order for people to arbitrate if the alternative state is worth it, i.e. voting for a risky option, like supporting exit, supporting hard Eurosceptic parties, is that they employ benchmarks from their own national system. When their own national system is performing well economically and performing well in terms of quality in government, they're more likely to become Eurosceptic because they perceive that alternative state as being viable. The difference with Matt Gabel's work, and I've communicated a lot with Matt about this, is that Matt thought that the outcomes, the good economic outcomes, would be attributed to the European Union. That is essentially an assumption he makes in the book, that these outcomes would be attributed to the national level. I do a whole set of experiments, survey experiments. People don't do that. They attribute outcomes, bad and good, to the domestic level. So in countries where the situation is poor, right, so where economic problems are high, quality of government is low, this means that people become more supportive of the EU because they think that their own national government is not delivering. However, in countries that are doing fairly well economically in terms of quality in government, they're also attributing that to their national government, i.e. to Merkel, not to Juncker, and therefore Euroscepticism rises. Right? So you get this almost the reversed hypothesis then from the utilitarian model. So now I just had to put it in this essay in one graph. So here I highlight two sets of member states. So those are member states in which the alternative state is not viable, i.e. where quality of government is below the EU mean and growth and unemployment are below the EU mean, versus countries where the alternative state will be viable. I'm not saying I think they're viable, but in terms of my method and my theory, in the alternative state is viable. And what you really see is that in those contexts where that are performing highly well in terms of economic growth, quality of government, low unemployment, etc., that support for less integration is markedly higher than in the contexts that are performing poorly, both in terms of democratic quality and economic outcomes. And hard Eurosceptic party support is also higher. And those differences are also statistically significant. So interestingly, I mentioned that already, for the Brits, the alternative state might not be so unclear anymore. And what I also do in one of the chapters of the book is to say, well, how can people benchmark the alternative state? So this book was largely written, and then part of the element we could do is we could have a panel survey where Brexit was in between. So I can map people's support for the EU prior to Brexit, and I can look what happens after Brexit, right? This is not 100% causal because other things might have changed, but clearly what people saw was the pound devaluing, the market, responding to that decision, and as a result, as we've been seeing now, and also the Eurobarometer has documented this, in the wake of that signal, that alternative state not looking that viable, support in the EU went up. I do have to put a caveat there. It went up with people who were already slightly ambivalently pro. It didn't really change the kind of Lega supporter or the FN supporter, but we do see a very strong increase in support for membership and support for further integration amongst people who were maybe on the fence before and are now more favorable of integration. So that's the idea that that benchmark of the alternative state is crucially important, and Brexit gives people information about that benchmark. So to kind of like in the essay, I wanted to say a little bit more than just on the book, so I'm finalizing now, is well, what does this tell us about international cooperation in general? And this is me going a bit on the limb, but I think nonetheless placing the European developments in a kind of more general context where you see also, Trump put on steel tariffs, Trump was elected in the United States. This is not just a European phenomenon. So the way of understanding how people form their opinions about international cooperation, how that is linked with how their countries are performing, or also, as I show in the book, how there are differences within countries in terms of how well regions are performing, highlights that these distinctive national narratives, something that, of course, sociologists like Juan Díaz-Medrano has already highlighted in his book in the early 2000s, is crucial, and we need to understand that more. And that probably would force us to move away from purely quantitative approaches to more qualitative approaches. So economic grievances or economic gains might not necessarily only be sufficient. So I highlight in the book that kind of risk perceptions are also really important. So who can bear those risks? So of the alternative state, when it's unknown, are those who are very poor, but also those who are very well off, because they can buffer the risk. So you get interesting bedfellows. So that's also what you see in the Trump vote, for example. You saw it in the Brexit vote. It also might be a paradoxical process where the EU or international cooperations and arrangements become actually the victim of their own success. So as economic and political gains from cooperation actually can be the source of opposition towards that international agreement and international cooperation. So that's kind of like a paradoxical process that we need to think about, and I think that doesn't only apply in the UK's. And I think, and this is just the last point, that a lot of this literature, both internationally and within the EU, has been framed very much in either economic grievances or cultural backlashes and verses and so on. And I think we really need to understand different ways in which people might think. That might be risk aversion, that might be the way these economic conditions interact with national conditions, how people are actually perceiving those conditions, not just the objective element of that, and that's what I do in the book, and how people then make trade-offs, given that they might score differently on some of these areas depending on which part of the kind of equation we're looking at. So we also really need to kind of move beyond that economic versus cultural backlash, but understand the interaction and understand the kind of full-fledged factors that go into people's opinions about international cooperation, and that varies across countries and across individuals and across groups within countries. So I think this is also just a lot of stuff that we can still do in the future to try to figure these things out. Thanks. Hopefully I stayed in time.
Perfect. Thank you, Catherine.